My name is Dana Whitfield and I am 31 years old. For 9 summers in a row, my parents drove me to my aunt's farmhouse the second week of June and did not come back for me until the last week of August, so my brother could have what my father called real childhood memories. 9 summers, 9 goodbyes on the same gravel driveway, and every single time, my mother said the exact same sentence before she got back in the car. Big girls travel light. I was 7 the first time I heard it. I was 16 the last time. And it took me until I was 26 to understand that sentence was never about luggage. It was about how much of me my family was willing to carry. Let me take you back to the summer I turned 7, because that is where the whole machine started. And if you have ever been the child who got left behind so someone else could be the favorite, you already know how this feels in your chest before I even say it. It began with a duffel bag, army green canvas, my father's old one from before he was married. My mother packed it herself the night before we left, and I remember standing in the doorway of my room watching her fold my shirts into perfect squares like she was preparing me for boarding school instead of a farmhouse 40 minutes away. I asked her why I couldn't come to the lake house with them that year. She didn't look up from the folding. She said Aunt Carol needed help with the chickens, and I was old enough to be useful now. I was 7. I did not know what useful meant yet, but I would learn. The drive to Aunt Carol's took 40 minutes down a 2-lane county road, past a grain silo and a church with a crooked steeple, and every single year my father would turn onto that gravel driveway, put the car in park, and check his watch before he even said hello to his own sister. My brother, Tyler, was 9 that first summer, and he stayed in the back seat the whole visit, headphones on, not once getting out to stretch his legs. He would be at the lake house by dinner. I would be at Aunt Carol's kitchen table by dinner, learning how to shell peas. Here is the detail that took me 19 years to say out loud to anyone. The lake house was booked every February. My mother told me about my summer at Aunt Carol's every year in late May, 3 months after the reservation was already confirmed. 3 months of planning a summer without me, and I was told about it with 3 weeks to spare. When people ask me now why I am careful, why I check things twice, why I never trust an invitation until it has a date attached, I tell them the truth. I learned to plan quietly by watching my own family plan around me. Every summer had the same shape after that. The duffel bag went into the trunk the second week of June, 40 minutes down the county road. A stiff hug from my mother on the porch, and then the car pulling away with 3 people in it instead of 4. And every July, without fail, a postcard would show up in Aunt Carol's mailbox addressed to me in my mother's slanted handwriting. Lake Placid, Cape Cod, Niagara Falls, the Adirondacks. 9 postcards over 9 years, and every single one ended with the same 4 words. Miss you, be good. I used to think that phrase was tender. It took me years to notice what it actually was. Not once did a card say come next year. Not once did it say we wish you were here with us. It was an instruction, not a longing. Be good. As if my whole job, my entire purpose that summer, was to not be a problem while the real family had its real summer somewhere else. Aunt Carol kept every single one of those postcards in a recipe tin on top of the refrigerator, and I never once saw her throw one away. At the time, I thought she just liked mail. Years later, I would understand she was building a case file, one she hoped she'd never have to use. To be fair to my parents, because I have worked hard to be exactly that fair and not 1 inch more, this story does not start with a duffel bag. It starts with a hospital room. When I was 4 and Tyler was 6, he was diagnosed with a heart condition that required 2 surgeries before he turned 8. I do not remember most of it. I was too young, but I grew up in the shadow of it, in a house that had already reorganized itself around one child's fragility before I was old enough to understand what fragile meant. My mother quit her job for 2 years. My father took every overtime shift the plant would give him. Casseroles showed up on our porch so often that my mother kept a running list of whose dish belonged to whom. Tyler's second surgery was a success. He came home at 8 years old with a clean bill of health, a scar down his chest, and a family that had permanently rearranged its center of gravity around him. I understand it, in the same way you understand why a house fire pulls everyone's attention. But here is the part that still makes my stomach drop when I say it out loud. Tyler's last surgery was in the spring I turned 5. The summers at Aunt Carol's didn't start until I was 7. 2 full years after the emergency ended, my parents were still running the family like the crisis was ongoing. Nobody ever stopped to ask if the arrangement that saved my brother's life still needed to exist once his life was no longer in danger. Triage had just become the family's permanent operating system, and nobody put down the clipboard. The summer I was 11, I finally asked to come to the lake house instead. I did it the right way too, because even at 11 I understood you had to build a case before you presented it. I wrote out 3 reasons on a piece of notebook paper. I practiced saying them in the bathroom mirror the night before, and then I stood in the kitchen while my mother packed the cooler and I read my 3 reasons out loud, my voice shaking on the second one. My mother set down the mustard jar. She knelt in front of me, the way she always did right before she said something that would stay with me for the rest of my life, and she told me this trip was for Tyler, that he had been through so much, that surely I understood. And when my eyes filled up despite everything I had rehearsed, she tucked a piece of hair behind my ear and said the sentence one more time. Big girls travel light. My father didn't say a word. He never did. His silence was its own kind of answer, and I had gotten very good at reading it. I went up to my room, and I did not cry where anyone could see me. I heard my parents loading the car an hour later, laughing about something, the screen door slapping shut behind them. But here is the sound that stayed with me longer than any of it. Around 8 that night, from the top of the stairs, I heard the wheels of the duffel bag rolling across the kitchen floor. I came down to look. It was already packed, already zipped, already sitting by the front door, waiting for a trip to Aunt Carol's that I had never agreed to and never would be asked about again. Somebody had answered my 3 reasons before I had even finished reading them out loud. I never asked to go to the lake house again after that summer. I had my answer, and I would carry it quietly for 4 more years, right up until the summer everything I thought I understood about my family turned out to be only half the story, and the other half was waiting for me in a phone call I was never supposed to overhear. I was 13 the night I found out what Aunt Carol had really offered my mother, and I found out by accident, the way most children learn the truth about their own families. It was late, past 11, and I had come downstairs at the farmhouse for a glass of water. The kitchen light was on. Aunt Carol was sitting at the table with the phone pressed to her ear, and her voice had a tone I had never heard from her before. Tight, almost begging. Let her live here for the school year, Diane. Just try it. A long pause. Then her voice went cold in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. That's not how it would look. That's your whole answer? Another silence, longer this time. You can't take back what you already agreed to on the porch. I must have made a sound, because Aunt Carol turned and saw me standing in my nightgown with an empty glass in my hand. Her whole face changed in a second, back into the aunt who baked me cookies and let me name the chickens. She told me the school year in town was boring anyway, nothing but mud season, and walked me back up to bed with her hand warm on my shoulder. We never spoke about that call again. I was 13. I understood only the temperature of it, that something important had been offered and refused, and that the refusal had a reason my aunt found unforgivable. I filed it away in the part of my mind that doesn't open until it's ready. It would be almost a decade before I learned exactly what my mother had turned down that night and exactly what excuse she used to do it. Something changes in a kid the year she stops asking for anything. My parents called it growing up. My teachers called me mature for my age. What it actually was arithmetic. Around 14, I started a notebook and wrote one date on the first page, June, the year I would graduate high school. Underneath it, I began a list that was really a countdown. I calculated what a room cost to rent in towns I had never seen. What a used car cost. What a person could save in 3 years if she was careful and quiet about it. And quiet was a language I already spoke fluently. The summer I was 17, I asked to stay home and work instead of going to Aunt Carol's, and my parents said yes before I even finished the sentence, already halfway through packing for 2 weeks at the lake. So responsible, my mother told the neighbors. That fast yes told me everything I needed to know about how much room I actually took up in their plans. I got a job at a diner off the highway, and every single night I rolled my tips into a rubber band and hid them inside an old boot in the back of my closet. By graduation, that boot held just over $5,000, and not one person in my house had ever once asked what I was saving it for. They assumed college. I let them assume it. I had already done my real research the old-fashioned way, at the public library, with an atlas spread open on a corner table. I picked my future off a page showing the coast of Oregon, a small town wrapped around a harbor, boats lined up like they were waiting for something. My rules were simple, far enough that nobody could show up on a whim, cheap enough to survive on diner wages while I figured out something better. And it had to need bakers, because thanks to Aunt Carol, baking was the one skill my hands knew better than almost anyone my age. I mailed out job inquiries that spring using a friend's address so nothing would trace back to our mailbox, and in May, an answer came back. A small bakery near the harbor needed help starting in July. I read that letter 4 times and slept better than I had in years. Graduation was the first Saturday of June, folding chairs on the football field, the sun already too warm for the gowns. I was up before dawn that morning, and by 7 my car was packed. The duffel bag went in the trunk first, out of habit more than anything, even though nobody was sending me anywhere this time. Underneath it, I hid the recipe tin I had quietly taken from Aunt Carol's kitchen the summer before, 9 postcards inside it, though I couldn't have told you why I needed to bring them. At 18, I called it proof. It took me years to admit it was really a wound I hadn't finished pressing on. My parents did come to graduation, and I want to be accurate about that, because accuracy is the only kind of fairness I have left for them. They sat through most of it. Then, 30 minutes in, during the W's, my mother leaned over and whispered that they needed to leave a little early because Tyler's new job downtown was hosting a celebration dinner and traffic would be bad. She squeezed my hand. "So proud of you," she said. When they finally called my name and I walked across that stage, I looked out at 2 empty folding chairs with programs still sitting on them. It didn't even hurt the way I expected. It felt like a final piece of evidence, like the universe handing me one last exact accounting of where I stood, so I could leave without any doubt left in me. That night, I ate dinner with my parents, said I was tired, and went up to my room. At 4 in the morning, I left. I put a note on the kitchen table, weighed down with the sugar bowl so it wouldn't blow away or get mistaken for trash. It said I was safe, I was an adult now, and please don't look for me. I drove for 2 days straight, sleeping once in a rest stop parking lot with the doors locked, and on the evening of the second day, I came around a bend in the road and saw the harbor town spread out below me, boats rocking gently in the water, and I had to grip the steering wheel because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. 18 years old, everything I owned in the back seat, and nobody on earth knew where I was. You would think that feels like falling. It felt like the first full breath I had taken since I was 7 years old. For the next 4 years, I built something nobody back home even knew existed. I worked my way up from counter help to head baker at that little harbor bakery. I found a studio apartment I could actually afford, fixed my own leaking faucet with a video from the library computer instead of calling the landlord, and told myself that was just being frugal. It wasn't frugal. It was a rule I had absorbed without ever choosing it. Needing things is a bill someone else has to pay, and I would rather go without than hand anyone that bill. I want you to remember that about me, because it is the exact flaw this whole story eventually turns on. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 4 years after I left, The bell over the bakery door rang while I had my hands full of dough, and I called out that I'd be right there without looking up. When I finally did look up, my mother was standing in the middle of my bakery in her good coat, and behind her, holding the door the way he held every door of my childhood, silent, was my father. 4 years and 2,000 miles between us, and the first thing out of my mother's mouth was not an apology. It was a question about how much this place had cost me. I poured them both coffee anyway, not because I owed them kindness, but because a woman standing on ground she built herself can afford to be generous with it. For 20 minutes, my mother gave me the version of my childhood she had clearly been rehearsing the whole drive. 9 wonderful summers with an aunt who adored me. Independence, handed to me as a gift. Look how well I had turned out because of it. I let her finish. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why now? Why for years? My father answered before my mother could stop him, which almost never happened. He has Parkinson's, my mother said quickly, cutting in over him, as if she needed to be the one to deliver the real reason. Diagnosed that spring. Early stage. Tyler can't be expected to manage it, she went on, listing his job and his kids and his career, and I felt the old shape of the sentence closing around me before she even finished it. You've always been the strong one, she said. It's time to come home. I looked at her hand on my wrist and understood, finally and completely, that even my father's diagnosis, had been sorted into the same old family math. Someone needed care, and I was still the name written next to the word available. I took my hand back gently. I told them I wasn't coming home to be assigned a role I never agreed to. But I also told them I wouldn't let anyone say I turned my back on a sick father, and I meant it. I said I would arrange in-home care myself, paid for out of my own savings, starting that week. I said I would call every Sunday and visit twice a year, as a guest invited, not as staff reporting for duty. My mother's composure finally cracked, right there at the counter, and what came out of her surprised all 3 of us. She told me that when she was 12, she had been the one taking care of her own mother alone, with nobody ever asking if she was managing it. Nobody ever asked me either, she said, and then went quiet, as if she'd heard herself say it for the first time in 50 years. I understood then that the whole system, the duffel bag, the postcards, being the strong one, wasn't something she invented out of cruelty. It was something she inherited and never once questioned, and then handed straight to me like it was a gift. That night, my father pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand on my way out, the way men of his generation hand you the things they can't say out loud. It was a photocopy of an investigator's report, dated a little over a year after I left, hired quietly on his own to find me. Case closed at client request. Underneath, in his shaking handwriting, a note he must have written recently. Your mother told me to stop looking. She said you'd come back when you needed us. I never should have listened. I'm sorry. It didn't fix everything. Nothing does that cleanly. But it told me something I badly needed to know, that once, before the family story got smoothed over and repackaged, somebody had actually looked for me. A year later, my father flies out twice a year to visit, slower on his feet now but steady enough to sit at my counter and watch me work the ovens. My mother and I speak on the phone carefully, in short calls that are enough, because enough is its own kind of fortune when you grew up with less. Aunt Carol finally told me the truth about that phone call I overheard at 13. She had offered to take me in for good, full-time, paid for entirely on her own, and my mother had said no, word for word, because of how it would look to send a daughter away for good instead of just for summers. 9 summers was the exact amount of absence a family photo could survive without anyone asking questions. My whole childhood had been measured out to the limit of appearances, like a strict diet, and I never once knew I was the one being rationed. The recipe tin sits on a shelf above my ovens now, 9 postcards inside it, and underneath each one of my mother's old messages, I have written what that summer actually was for me. Not for anyone else to read. For me, so I never forget what those years cost and what I built instead of resenting them forever. If any of this sounds like your own childhood, if you were ever the one packed off so someone else could be the favorite, I want you to hear this clearly. Being the strong one was never a compliment. It was a job nobody asked if you wanted. And you are allowed to quit it, build your own table, and decide for yourself who gets a seat at it.